Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 78, Alternity, GammaWorld, and HeroQuest. Before we start this week's show, I do want to note, I'm sure by now you figured out the audio doesn't quite sound like what we've been putting out lately. Rest assured, I am aware of it, but it's what I've got to kind of tolerate. We're making a few changes here around the worldwide headquarters, so it's going to be just a little off this week, probably next week, but I can assure you in 2 weeks we will definitely have the new setup running the way we need to, and the audio will not only be what you become accustomed to, but better, and I can promise you that. So just a couple of weeks of something being a little off, and then we'll be right back where we need to be. Okay. So after 2 weeks in a row covering Dungeons & Dragons related material, we need to get back into the larger sea of role-playing games, and quite frankly I couldn't think of 3 better subjects to get back on that track with. So without further ado, let's crank up the tour bus and get to it. Alternity is a science fiction role-playing game published by TSR. Designed by Bill Slavichek and Richard Baker, it was released in 1998. That same year, the first campaign setting was released, called Star Drive. When Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR, they discontinued the line in 2000 as a part of what they called a broader rationalism of TSR's business holdings. However, there still is a devoted, if small, fan base for the game. And Alternity has survived. I should say parts of it have survived, along with TSR's Star Frontiers game, as the D20 future setting Wizards published in the early aughts when they released a ton of D20 games. Sasquatch Games attempted to revive the Alternity game in June of 2018 with a Kickstarter campaign. However, that campaign was ultimately unsuccessful. Over the years, Alternity got 5 core products, including the introductory box set. They also had 5 accessories and 4 campaign settings. Other than Star Drive, which I mentioned a moment ago, Dark Matter, which is similar to X-Files, GammaWorld, which we'll expand on momentarily, and StarCraft Adventures, which was based on the StarCraft computer game from Blizzard Entertainment, were the other settings. With the history covered, let's break down the system itself. Characters in Alternity were created using the point-buy system and could either be humans, mutants, any one of a number of alien species from the core books, or aliens created by the GM. Now, there are no classes per se in Alternity. Instead, there are professions, which would dictate what skills and abilities were cheaper for any given character to get, though there were a few skills, like psionics, that were only available to specific professions. Skills are classified into broad and specialty skills. Earning a specialty skill required an associated broad skill, which would require a character to have enough associated ability points. The special skills were further classified into ranks, which would impact the skill's scores. Skill scores were presented with the full score, half that score, and 1/4 of that score. Those represented the numbers needed to achieve ordinary, good, or amazing successes in an action round. Resolving actions in Alternity is a bit different than in other systems, as it uses both a control die and a situation die. When the roll is called for, one of each is rolled. The control die is always a d20. The situation die, on the other hand, can be a 0, 4, 6, 8, 12, or 20-sider. And for the record, if a 0 is called for, that means the action rests only on the control die. One other possible wrench in the works is that the situation die can be either plus or minus, meaning it can either be added to or subtracted from the control die. Whatever the result of the roll is will be compared to the action, skill, or feat to determine success or failure. For the record, Alternity is a system that goes with low being best, so pray for those ones on your rolls. And depending on how far below the skill score the player rolled, there are 3 progressively better layers of success, or, depending on how much above the skill they rolled, 2 levels of failure. The only rolls that didn't use the d20 were armor and damage. So I mentioned a variety of possible situation dice. The die type chosen depends on the difficulty of the action. Here's where Alternity continues to be different from other systems, as difficulty is scaled in die types. Minus d20, minus d12, minus d8, minus d4, 0, plus d4, plus d6, plus d8, plus d12, plus d20, plus 2d20, and plus 3d20. There are some base ideas with plus d4 for broad skill or feat checks and 0 for specialty skills or actions. A minus situation bonus means the player uses a larger negative situation die set, while a plus situation penalty means, as you'd expect, the larger positive situation set would be used. Again, low is good, high is bad, which means plus 3d20 would be very bad. So let's move on to the anatomy of an action round. Each round is split up into 4 phases, each of which relates to one of the degrees of success that are achievable on an action check. Amazing, good, ordinary, and marginal from first to last. In any given phase, the character only gets 1 action attempt. D20 rolls are used to determine the order of action for players, which is a variation of initiative. Also, the roll determines the earliest phase that the character can act in. All of the actions in a phase take place at the same time, much like a combat round in pretty much every other game we've covered on the show to this point. Of course, it also means that the results of all of those actions are applied at the end of the phase. Now, that's a bit different than usual, but it works within the framework of the game. A character can act in as many phases as they have actions per round. Life points are the system used in Alternity instead of hit points, and they're categorized into stun, wound, and mortal damage. Stun damage immobilizes, but isn't life-threatening. Those points are restored at the end of the scene. Wound damage can immobilize a character and will inflict 1 stun damage for every 2 wound damage. And the best way to restore wounds are to rest. Mortal damage can flat out kill a character and inflict 1 wound point for every 2 mortal. You're going to need the medical science surgery skill to get mortal damage fixed. Durabilities can also be repaired by healing. Alternity was intended to be a generic rule set, with the intent being to allow others to build campaign worlds around it. However, it wasn't marketed very well and therefore sold poorly. When the D20 system caught fire, Wizards just abandoned it completely. So I talked about all of the dice used in Alternity, and you might have noticed I didn't mention the D10. That was intentionally left out of the game, most likely to avoid comparisons to World of Darkness. No reviews for Alternity this week, so let's just go ahead and move on to the next game on today's tour. GammaWorld is also a sci-fi role-playing game, originally designed by James Ward and Gary Jaquette, and the first edition was published by TSR in 1978. Yeah, I said something about GammaWorld being a setting for Alternity, and it was. It was a modification of this game, just so we're clear. For the record, GammaWorld borrows heavily from Ward's earlier game, Metamorphosis Alpha. The first edition release was a box set and had a 56-page rulebook, a map of North America, which had been devastated, and dice. TSR later published 3 accessories. 2 were adventures, Legion of Gold and Famine in Fargo. They also published the GammaWorld referee screen. Grenadier Miniatures also got in on the action with a licensed line of minis for use with the game. There was one other TSR product that was announced, and that was Metamorphosis Alpha to Omega, which would have been a full-on adaptation of the Metamorphosis Alpha campaign setting to GammaWorld, but work on it was stopped by TSR when they announced the second edition of GammaWorld. That second edition, credited to James Ward, Gary Jaquette, and David James Ritchie, was released by TSR in 1983. It was also a box set containing the rulebook and map along with dice. 2 more adventures were released, The Cleansing War of Garrick Blackhand and The Mind Masters. There was also the GammaWorld referee screen and mini-module, as well as GammaWorld character sheets released to support this version of the game. TSR took back miniature production for this version, releasing 4 packs of GammaWorld minis to support 2nd edition. Much like with the previous edition, work on another adventure module with the working title Rapture of the Deep was begun but not completed or released at that time, though it's been rumored that this was the module released in 2007. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. 3rd edition of GammaWorld was yet another box set, though James Ward got sole credit on that. This box introduced the action control table to the GammaWorld game. Action control tables were used to resolve pretty much all of the actions in a game and were TSR's big thing once they'd proven successful with the 1984 Marvel's Superheroes release. And I'm not kidding about that. They put the damn things in pretty much all of their non-D&D products, but I digress. TSR got hammered on this version, primarily on the number of editorial mistakes in the release. One of their major sins was cross-referencing rules that didn't exist in the box set. It got so bad that TSR had to publish a GammaWorld rules supplement that had those missing rules in it. And at least they gave it out for free, so long as gamers requested it by mail. They also made sure it was included in all future printings of the box set. There were 5 modules published for GammaWorld, and for the first time the setting had a multi-module plot, which involved rebuilding an ancient sky chariot. The adventures were Alpha Factor, Beta Principle, Gamma Base, Delta Fragment, and Epsilon Cyborgs. However, the storyline was left incomplete when the 3rd edition of GammaWorld was abandoned. It was unofficially completed in 2003 with the release Omega Project. And despite all the headaches 3rd edition produced, it won the 1986-1987 Gamer's Choice Award for Best Science Fiction Role-Playing Game. Let's fast forward to 1992 and the 4th edition of GammaWorld. Written by Bruce Nesmith and James Ward, this edition dropped the box set concept in favor of a 192-page softcover book. It also dropped the action control table because a lot of gamers thought it sucked, if we're being honest. Instead, it picked up mechanics that made it quite similar to 2nd edition AD&D, which makes a lot of sense since both of those are TSR products. 5 adventures were published for 4th edition: Treasures of the Ancients, The Overlord of Bonpar, Mutant Master, All Animals Are Equal, and Home Before the Sky Falls. At Gen Con 1993, the GammaWorld team announced there would be no new 4th edition materials released, and that was mostly because of TSR deciding to crank up production on Metamorphosis Alpha to Omega. And I know it's not what we're covering today, but that particular product eventually published using the Amazing Engine, for those who've seen that particular game engine before, and we might cover it again on a future show. GammaWorld got its 5th edition, but there's a catch. This was the supplement for Alternity. Yep, see, I told you, I mentioned it, now we're getting back around to it. And in a humorous moment, the back cover of that book actually reads, "That's right, it's the return of GammaWorld." It was the response to some criticism over the multiple editions of the game over the years, which means there should be coming for D&D any day now, right? I don't know. Anyway, 5th edition was written by Andy Collins and Jeff Grubb, and it was released through Wizards of the Coast in 2000. Another 192-page softcover book, it had the slight disadvantage of releasing 1 month after Wizards announced the cancellation of Alternity. And it's also unique to the various editions that we're covering today in that it had no supplemental materials released for it. 2002 brought a quasi-GammaWorld game to the public, though on a very limited basis. In September of that year, Jonathan Tweet wrote up Omega World, which was a D20 system minigame based on GammaWorld. It was only available in Dungeon Magazine number 94 and Polyhedron Magazine number 153. No expansions or wide release ever happened, though those who've played this game tend to find it very entertaining. By 2003, Wizards of the Coast had decided they wanted out of the GammaWorld business and licensed the property to Sword and Sorcery Studios. In 2003, the 6th edition of GammaWorld was released, and though it wasn't a Wizards product, it certainly mimicked one. It used Wizards' D20 Modern system and even mimicked Wizards' D&D philosophy of 3 core rulebooks. Those books were the GammaWorld Player's Handbook, written by Bruce Baugh, Ian Eller, Maiko Ralalati, and Jeff Skellums. GammaWorld Game Master's Guide, written by Baugh along with Werner Hager, Lizard, and Doug Oglesby, and GammaWorld Machines and Mutants, written by David Bullock, Gareth Hanran, Patrick O'Duffy, and Chuck Wendig. By the way, these books were hardcover, unlike the 3 supplements, which were in paperback. Those were GammaWorld Beyond the Horizon by Ellen Kiley, GammaWorld Cryptic Alliances and Unknown Enemies by Owen K.C. Stevens, Alejandro Melchor, and Jeff Skellums, and GammaWorld Out of the Vaults by James Maslowski, John Sneed, and Ellen Kiley. 6th edition was a much different version in the tone and tenor, as it was much darker than the previous 5 editions, which had put themselves into more of a lighthearted and adventurous approach. It was also the first edition of the game to feature fantastical nanotechnology on a large scale. In August of 2005, White Wolf reverted the rights to GammaWorld back to Wizards of the Coast, which killed the 6th edition line. For the record, there are a number of critics and gamers online who've said over the years that the Jeff Tweet Omega World was far superior to this D20 version of the game. Oh, and did I mention there have been 7 editions of this game? Well, Wizards announced at the Dungeons & Dragons experience in early 2010 that that version would be coming out. Called D&D GammaWorld, it released in October of 2010 and was fully compatible with 4th edition D&D as well as the system reference document. However, Wizards made it a point to announce that it was its own game and not a separate D&D setting. released in a series of box sets. Those were D&D GammaWorld Role-Playing Game by Richard Baker and Bruce Cordell, D&D GammaWorld Expansion Kit Fama in Fargo by Robert Schwalb, and D&D GammaWorld Expansion Kit Legion of Gold, also by Baker and Cordell. Trouble in Freesboro was released for Game Day 2010, while Pax Extraterrestre was released at the 2010 Penny Arcade Expo. 7th edition also got a Christmas-themed adventure and a set of vehicular combat rules released online, but that's not all. 2 novels were also released and were set in this version. Sooner Dead by Mel Odom in February of 2011, and Red Sails in the Fallout by Paul Kidd in July of 2011. One more note on 7th edition. In 2011, there was a video game adaptation announced at E3 called GammaWorld Alpha Mutation. It was set to be released for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC. Bedlam Games was creating the game, while Atari was set to release it. However, for unknown and never announced reasons, the game was never released and was in fact canceled before it could be completed. As of this recording, there are no further plans for an 8th edition of the game, so if you're looking to play it, you're going to either need a store that sells used games, or you'll have to find the PDF online, and we tend to recommend either the publisher's website or drivethrurpg.com. So with the history of the game out of the way, why don't we check out the setting? GammaWorld is set in the mid-25th century, a bit longer than 1,000 years after a second nuclear war basically destroyed human civilization. Now, the war itself is left pretty vague in the various editions of the game, though each version provided a couple of rumors or thoughts about it. We're not going to get into those today because, in my opinion, they're not germane to the conversation. What all of the editions agree on is that everything that went down destroyed all governments and societies larger than a village, which basically set the world back to an almost prehistoric level. Do you think I'm kidding? The first edition of the game listed the crossbow as the ultimate weapon. Now, the 2003 and 2010 editions did have some advanced tech that was readily available and fairly well known. On the flip side of that, in the other editions, advanced tech was considered to be artifacts, and using them came with a ton of risks, since, of course, most characters wouldn't have a clue about how to use them. Think of it like this. Hand a semi-automatic pistol to someone from the 13th century and see how well they do with it. For those of us who own and have fired one, it's not a big deal. For someone who has never fired a gun because they don't exist, there would probably be a whole lot of negative outcomes while they figured out how to work it. Anyway, the inhabitants of Earth of the game period refer to the planet as GammaWorld, or in later editions, Gamma Terra. When you dig deeper into GammaWorld, you'll find an environment full of chaos and danger, and it's nothing like we see Earth today, except maybe if you're paying too much attention to worldwide governments, but that's another story. Let's put it this way. The power of the weapons utilized in the last war managed to change coastlines, level entire cities, and leave large chunks of land worldwide with level of radiation that will kill you on contact. In addition to the radiation, which seems to hit pretty much the entire planet in some form or another, you've also got the biochemical agents used because, of course you do. These two things combined have caused a number of very interesting mutations, including extra limbs, super strength, and psychic powers. For the record, there's a random table for mutations that's a part of every edition of the game to work these very things out. You want to have even more fun? Many of the plants and animals remaining on GammaWorld are sentient, and some of those have even put together their own communities that compete for resources with humans. Think an entire village of rocket raccoons and Groots versus an entire village of Peter Quills and Gamoras. It's not a perfect analogy, I'll grant you, but you get the basic idea. PCs in the game can either be unmutated humans, which are also known as pure strain humans, mutated humans, sentient animals or plants, and androids. Adventuring groups explore ancient ruins and post-apocalyptic societies searching for knowledge of the ancients, which are the pre-war humans. They're also trying to gain some social status for themselves. If you've ever played a post-apocalyptic set game, the themes that run through the adventures for GammaWorld are pretty much the same as in those games, with the GammaWorld twist added to them. Okay, so I could go on about the setting for like another hour, but I still need to discuss the system of GammaWorld, plus hit our third topic for the day, so let's move on and check out how GammaWorld is run. One thing to note about the system itself is that through the various editions of the game, GammaWorld has pretty much always been nearly compatible with whatever the current edition of D&D was. In fact, attribute generation works the same way as it does in D&D, with the 3d6 method of rolling scores, which will generate numbers between 3 and 18. The names of the attributes are a bit different, like physical strength instead of strength and mental strength instead of wisdom, but the basics are the same, and that's what would allow a GM to bring their GammaWorld characters into a D&D game or vice versa, provided, of course, you can find a reasonable game method to do so. As I've hinted at throughout this section, character generation is pretty random. I mentioned the mutation table a minute ago, and this is one of the creation parts for characters that separates them from D&D. If your player wants to play a mutant, then dice are rolled to randomly determine what that mutation is. Of course, I cheat, so I'd probably allow my players to choose their mutations, within reason. GammaWorld makes no attempts to be anywhere near realistic about these mutations, as the inclusion of psychic powers would note. And for all of the advantages mutations can give, there are also mutations with a downside. Skin that dissolves in water, seizures, phobias. Listen, if you can think of it, there's probably a negative for it. Experience points in GammaWorld work pretty much the same as they do in D&D. However, the first 2 editions of the game don't have true character classes or levels, so raising ranks, which are the level equivalents for the game, don't bring with them increases in skills or abilities. For the first 3 editions, rank pretty much denotes the social status, rather than the abilities to kick ass and take names. The resolution of actions in the game swung all over the place from edition to edition, and seems to be the one thing that varied that much. In the first 2 editions, much like in the early editions of D&D, matrix-based mechanisms were the rules. What that meant is that there was a chart that was cross-referenced to determine what each character involved in a combat would have to roll to be successful. For non-combat, the matrix would dictate exactly what the result would be. Pain in the ass to run, as I remember from my early AD&D days, trust me. 3rd edition realized that, and so the matrix was replaced with the action control table, or ACT. It was a single color-coded chart that would allow players and GMs to know success and degrees of success with a single die roll. And yes, this came from the Marvel Superheroes game that TSR had released around that same time. The ACT required the GM to cross-reference the difficulty of a character's action with the ability score used to complete that action in order to determine which column on the ACT to use. Percentile dice were then rolled and compared to the table with no additional rolls required. I'll skip 4th edition because I noted it pretty much straight up followed AD&D 2nd edition rules. 5th and 6th editions basically made GammaWorld a setting rather than a full-on game, so for 5th edition you needed the Alternity rulebook, and the mechanics worked as they did in that game, which I covered earlier in the show. 6th edition required the D20 Modern book in order to play, and again followed that book to the letter. 7th edition, as I mentioned a few moments ago, uses a streamlined version of the D&D 4th edition rules, though they do make some changes. One of them is that character generation was completely randomized. Even the class required the player to roll dice and take what they got to the character origin table. Attributes, mutations, and skills were also random. 7th edition also introduced cards to the party, with 2 decks that were basically the core of a proposed but never fully realized collectible card game. One had random alpha mutations on it, while the other had Omega Tech. Both allowed for the temporary gain of either a mutation or technology, though it should be noted that the chance of the tech backfiring on the character was pretty good. Despite these and several other changes to the game, you could still use GammaWorld characters in a 4th edition D&D setting, and vice versa. Before we finish with this segment of the show, let's get a couple of reviews of GammaWorld in. Ronald Peer reviewed the game for the Space Gamer number 32. He said, quote, "If you liked its progenitors, GammaWorld is an interesting variant. Beginning players should find it easy to learn, and referees are challenged to create a playable, balanced world. It's somewhat expensive, and the sudden death power of futuristic weaponry and the lack of character levels may put you off, but if the basic premise is appealing, you'll probably enjoy GammaWorld." End quote. Chris Bayless reviewed the game for Imagine Magazine and said, quote, "For a post-nuclear Holocaust game, GammaWorld has just about all the right ingredients in the correct proportions. It is a very good introduction into the fantasy world of role-playing and should seriously rival all other RPGs." End quote. We've got one more subject to cover today, so let's get to it. HeroQuest was first announced by Chaosium as a part of the RuneQuest 2nd edition rulebook. The book specifically stated that HeroQuest was, quote, "an FRP wherein the mighty of Glorantha might enter into the lands of legends and myth, penetrating the immortal stories to participate in the gods' war, fight against chaos in the great darkness, or aid in the trials of the Lightbringers or the Protectors. A revolutionary approach to myth, magic, and role-playing. by the Chaosium, end quote. However, at that time, it was more of a concept and less of a game. Now, that being said, nearly 20 years later, Greg Stafford, who'd created the Glorantha setting for Chaosium, left the company to create Isseries Inc. He learned that Robin Laws was a fan of that setting, so he made the choice to bring Laws in to create a new game to fit the setting that he'd originally created. By 1998, the game was under full development, using the name Glorantha the Game. Stafford used the Chaosium staff, with whom he was still friendly, as the playtest group for that new game. Now, what needs to be noted here is that the difference between RuneQuest and the new game is that this new game was a storytelling game, as opposed to a straight-up fight game. By mid-98, the name of the game had been changed to Hero Wars. Stafford had wanted to name it HeroQuest, as it was a term used within Glorantha lore for 20 years, but the Milton Bradley Company owned the trademark for HeroQuest, as they'd released a board game that had nothing to do with the role-playing game. So, with Laws' completed game ready for a May 1998 public demo at Glorantha Con 7, Hero Wars was the name they went with. And at the very last minute, Stafford decided to print some t-shirts for the event, both to promote the event and drum up some interest in the new game. As he relayed to Shannon Appelkline, quote, "I was the one who ended up making those shirts that read Hero Wars, the Initiation. A Heroes War logo of some sort was needed, so I laid out the words in a simple font without paying much attention to it. When I laid out that logo, I printed it in bright orange, figuring it would be very visible against a black shirt. I never imagined that I was designing the logo that would be used down to the bright orange color on the Hero Wars books for years to come." End quote. Hero Wars wound up being the first professional product Isseries Inc. produced, and it was published as a novel-sized trade paperback. Credit, or blame as we'll discuss in a moment, for this layout should be attributed to Eric Rowe of Wizard's Attic, who believed the game would sell better in bookstores if this particular format was used. But Hero Wars was never able to break out of the mass market, and the choice of format constrained that layout, therefore making the books look very simplistic. Also, they didn't fit in well with most game store displays. But Isseries supported the new game to the hilt, publishing about a half a dozen Hero Wars books from 2000 to 2002. The majority of the books, Thunder Rebels in 2000, Storm Tribe in 2001, Barbarian Adventures in 2001, and Orlanth is Dead in 2002, focused on the Sartre rites. I'm not sure if I got that completely correct on the pronunciation, but I tried. Apologies. Around 2003, Isseries finally sold out of their original printings of the core book. Stafford wanted to revise the Hero Wars rules into a new edition, and this printing was going to be the standard size for game rulebooks. And in a fortunate turn of events, Milton Bradley's trademark on HeroQuest had finally lapsed, so Stafford was able to publish this new edition, technically the second edition, but we're not numbering it like that, under the name he originally wanted. The version of the game most experts call second edition was revised by Robin Laws and released by Moon Design Publications under a license from Isseries. This edition was mostly setting free, which allowed the GMs to set it wherever they wanted to. In 2013, Stafford sold the HeroQuest trademark to Moon Design, and they followed up with a HeroQuest Glorantha in 2015. This integrated the HeroQuest game into the Glorantha setting as it never had been before, which is really what Stafford had envisioned when he initially wanted the game produced. 1 year later, MoonQuest got the controlling interest in Chaosium, and they published two Glorantha set HeroQuest supplements, one in 2016 and the other in 2017. 2020 brought another change to HeroQuest with the release of a free system reference document for HeroQuest called QuestWorlds SRD. Around this same time, Moon Design sold the HeroQuest trademark to Hasbro, and they rebranded the HeroQuest role-playing game as QuestWorlds. Now for now, that's where we stand on this very popular role-playing game. With the Hasbro Wizards of the Coast propensity to release new editions of their games at the drop of a hat, it wouldn't surprise me to see yet another version of the game come out sometime in the near future, though I didn't see any chatter to that effect during my research. So with history out of the way, let's look at the system itself. HeroQuest's main focus is on a dramatic presentation and storytelling technique, which basically means the game is built around abilities and keywords. Keywords is a broad term used to sum up several abilities, like a profession or a homeland or a culture. We'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. When it comes to character creation, there are three main methods to choose from: prose, list, or as you go. The prose method requires the player to describe their character in a couple of sentences totaling 100 words, no more, no less. The player then selects words and phrases from the description to be used as character abilities. Now, depending on where the game is set, the keywords can lay out a profession, homeland, affiliations. They can even imply certain abilities. The list method involves the player choosing one or more keywords, with the GM deciding what keywords would be appropriate for the setting, and then choose up to 10 additional abilities and up to 3 flaws. The as-you-go method has the player stating their character concept, then defining keywords and abilities during play based on what they think their character would know. For the record, there are benefits and flaws in all 3 methods, especially if you have a min-maxer in your group. It's up to the GM to rein that in a bit so as not to have a player that's running their character as you go and suddenly seeming to know everything and being able to do everything. Okay, so let's get a little more into keywords and how they work with abilities. It should be noted for the record that keywords are an optional rule, but since the majority of players playing the game use them, we're going to treat them like they're standard. Keywords allow for the grouping of abilities together in order to make things run a bit smoother than usual. Here's an example. One of my keywords is blacksmith. Using the keyword method, any ability that would reasonably pertain to being a blacksmith is covered under that keyword. Of course, I could also have one that said soldier, and the same thing would be true. Some cover culture, while others pertain to magical traditions. Abilities have a level from 1 to 20, which represents how good the character is in that ability. In the case of keywords, all of the abilities under that keyword have the same level. So if I'm a blacksmith at level 15, I'm pretty damn good at weaponsmithing, armorsmithing, making horseshoes, and anything else that falls under the category. If by chance I can add points to my abilities, which I can over the course of adventuring, then I get that much better. Once I get a score above 20, I now gain a level of mastery, and we'll get to that in a minute. I've said it multiple times thus far that keywords can cover pretty much everything, but it should also be noted that abilities that are of equal level can work at equal levels to solve a problem. For instance, if my level 13 soldier wanted to fight a level 13 scholar, one is going to try to talk the other out of it, and they've got as equal a chance of doing that as the fighter does of getting the scholar to draw their weapon. It's a bit confusing at first, but once you play it, things get clearer. Rolls in HeroQuest are built around 2 20-sided dice. You roll one for the ability and the other rolls resistance, which is chosen by the GM. Resistances can include abilities of NPCs, obstacles, or forces of nature, just to name 3 possibilities. The results aren't compared, by the way. Instead, the implied results are compared. Results are ranked from fumble through failure and success to critical. Once again, we're dealing with a low roll system, so a 1 is a critical success, anything under the ability score is a success, and anything over that score is a failure, with 20 being a fumble. Like I said before, there are levels of victory or defeat. Complete is when the results differ by 3 levels. Major is when the results differ by 2 levels. Minor is a 1-level difference. Marginal victory or tie is when the levels are equal. In that case, the lower die roll wins. If they're equal, it's a tie. Now, I mentioned the GM choosing resistances a moment ago. In the most recent version of the game, it's noted that the resistances should be based on what the dramatic requirements of the story necessitate rather than the raw numbers the obstacle would determine. That's in keeping with the narrative aspect of the game. The published scenarios for HeroQuest reflect this, as most of them don't have stats for opposing objects and NPCs. That's left up to the GM to decide based on what's dramatically important. Now, it should be noted that most obstacles are a 1-roll deal. However, those things considered to be important, like the finale of the story, should probably be extended contests with multiple 1-roll situations. In that instance, you'd keep score of which side won and lost, and when you've run through all of them, whoever's in the lead wins. I know I've been going for a long time at this point, but we're almost done. Just a couple more details I wanted to get out before we wrap. Modifiers in HeroQuest can be applied by the GM to take into account situational factors like injured PCs, more than one opponent in the test, or specialized and/or inappropriate abilities being used. On the flip side, players can get bonuses to their target numbers by using other appropriate abilities to boost the one they're using or by using the help of their friends. I said we'd hit on masteries, so let's do that. As I said a moment ago, once an ability score goes above 20, it gets a level of mastery. In that case, the 20 becomes a rune, and the extra level is the number of the level itself. So level 21 would be read as Rune 1. There's a whole chart comparing the various levels of runes and how they compare in competition with each other, but I'd need a spreadsheet to detail it, so I'm just going to leave it with the basics for now. Last up are hero points. These are awarded at the end of successful adventures. They're used to improve abilities, but can be banked and used to bump contest results, just like masteries can. The difference is, while masteries are automatically applied, the player must declare they're using a hero point. In gameplay, using hero points means the character is summoning up reserves that the normal humanoid wouldn't have in an attempt to bend the odds into their favor. HeroQuest is still being played around the world today, so chances are there's probably a game going on near you at this very moment. If you're interested, check online or at your local game shop for groups looking for players. And with that, we've come to the end of today's tour. Next week, we get old school as we check out Chainmail, Blackmoor, and City State of the Invincible Overlord. In the meanwhile, I'd suggest you check out our other podcast, Bad GM's Campaign Build-Along. It's a show where we build an entire campaign from scratch for you to run for your group. Season 2 begins this week, and we'll lay out the basic rules and concepts for this season's game, which is Fallout. So, if you're looking for a post-apocalyptic game based on a wildly successful video game series, check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Role-Playing History is a production of Bad GM Productions. Check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/gaming/BadGMProd, on Twitter at BadGMP, YouTube, we're Bad GM Productions, Tumblr, we're also Bad GM Productions. You can email us, badgmproductions@gmail.com, and online, our website is badgmproductions.net. Next week, it's the OG games, Chainmail and Blackmoor, and the OG setting, City of the Invincible Overlord. But that's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.